Welcome to today's webinar on Southwest Minnesota Arts Council's Art Project and Art Legacy Project grants for our fiscal year 2020, which runs from July 2019 through June 2020. I am Carolyn Koska, the Financial and Grants Administrator here at SMOC. I'll just let you know I have everyone muted at the moment, and I'll keep you muted through most of the presentation. If you have questions come up, please feel free to type them in the chat window at the side of your screen, and I'll kind of watch and see if anything's coming through. We'll also stop a couple of times for questions, and at the end of the presentation, I'll just open everybody up and we can discuss anything. So what we're going to talk about today, we'll start out a little bit with some information about Southwest Minnesota Arts Council, or SMOC. We'll look at the guidelines for these two grant programs. We'll show you what's available for you on the website. We'll go into our online grant system and look at what kinds of questions you'll be answering on the application. We'll talk about the process that you'll go through once you have submitted an application. And then, like I mentioned before, at the end, we will open it up for any discussion or questions that you may have. Southwest Minnesota Arts Council, or SMOC, is a nonprofit organization committed to promoting and encouraging the development of the arts in the 18 counties of Southwest Minnesota by serving as a source of funds and technical services, which enable local organizations, educational institutions, and individuals to sponsor, create, and promote the arts in their communities. We are one of 11 regional arts councils that cover the state of Minnesota, and we are, of course, down in this southwest corner here. Those are the counties that we cover. We receive our funding from the state of Minnesota's general fund, an allocation from that, as well as Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage or Legacy Fund. And finally, we also receive funding from the McKnight Foundation for our grants for individual artists. The particular programs that we're talking about today mainly use the Arts and Cultural Heritage or Legacy Fund, and also some of that state general fund money. Some things that we are committed to are supporting artists and arts organizations in creating, producing, and presenting high-quality arts activities, overcoming barriers to accessing high-quality arts activities, instilling the arts into the community and public life, supporting high-quality, age-appropriate arts education for all ages to develop knowledge, skills, and understanding of the arts, and supporting events and activities that represent the diverse ethnic and cultural arts traditions of the region. So these are just some things to keep in mind as you are thinking about projects that you might want to do to remember that it all needs to feed back up into these commitments. We'll talk first about the Art Project Grant Program. This is open to nonprofit organizations and also units of government, which would be a city or a county within the 18 counties of our service region, to stimulate and encourage the creation, performance, and appreciation of the arts in the region. So these are some types of projects that we can fund under this program. Music performances, which could be projects by community choirs, bands, or orchestras, as well as performances brought into the community. Dance performances, the same, whether they are put on by community organizations or something that's brought in. Community theater or prepackaged theater, which would be bringing in a group like Prairie Fire or Missoula Children's Theaters. Visual art exhibits, readings by authors, art classes for community members of any age, public art like adding a mural or sculpture to your city, and arts festivals. Art project grants are available for up to $7,000 And unless you are doing one of those prepackaged theater projects, which I mentioned before, those you can request up to $2,500. That smaller amount matches up with those types of projects that are also available for schools to apply for under the Arts in the Schools program. So we're just kind of keeping those at the same level, whether it's a community organization applying for that type of project through the art project grant or a school applying for that from a schooled grant. So you can request up to 80% of your project's cost, or that 7,000, whichever is less. So you'll need to provide at least a 20% cash match toward your project. So if your project cost exactly $7,000 to put on, you would be able to receive $5,600 in a grant and would need to come up with $1,400 on your own. Or for instance, if it cost more than that 7,000, if it costs $10,000, 80% would be 8,000, but you're limited to 7,000. So you would need to come up with $3,000 as your cash match. If your organization receives operating support from us, you are not able to include prorated general operating costs in the budget for your art project. Organizations that are not receiving operating support will often prorate out some of their general expenses in their project budget. So for instance, if they are putting on an art exhibit, they might then say, we are also asking for this percent of the gallery rent and utilities, which they could not do if they were receiving operating support. Now we'll talk about art legacy projects. Again, this is open to the same group of organizations and units of government, but art legacy projects are for large-scale projects that will leave an arts legacy in Southwest Minnesota. So it can be all of those same types of projects that we just read through in art project, but they need to be larger scale, provide sustainable arts access in the community. So there should be a longer term impact with that. And the art legacy project should go beyond the organization's regular programming and activities. So if you're a theater group and every year you do a summer musical, and maybe this year it's a little more expensive, so you want a little or more money, the art legacy project is not the place for that. It really needs to be something above and beyond your regular organization activities. What we mostly see in this program are public art projects, murals, sculptures in communities, things like that. If you are planning one of those very large scale projects to do an art legacy grant, we have a planning grant available for you that helps you figure out all of your components and everything that you'll need to know to be able to apply for the legacy grant. So if you request one of these planning grants, it would enable you to do things like get input from your community on what this project is going to be. You can put together the request for proposals from artists and pay maybe your top 3 artists a stipend to then produce that proposal. If you're just trying to figure out what would this even cost and need to do some research that costs money and able to do that, or just what would go into maintaining this if it's a physical piece of art that you're going to be working on, figuring out the plans for how you're going to maintain this structure in the future. So these planning grants have monthly deadlines from August through November and January through April. So you can kind of get going on your project a little whenever you are ready to do that. So the Art Legacy Project grants are available for up to $25,000 and the planning grants for $2,500. Again, the max is 80% of the project's costs, and you need to come up with that 20% cash match. Just some eligibility items to be aware of. The following are not eligible for these grants: projects that don't have an art focus, activities of a for-profit project, organization, or business, educational projects within a school system. As I mentioned before, they have their own program that they need to apply through. Requiring artists to pay excessive entry or exhibition fees, activities taking place outside of Minnesota. Because we are using state funding for these grants, they want everything to take place within the state. Also not eligible are activities that are not open to the public, activities for the religious socialization of the participants or audience, fundraising events. In other words, receiving this grant funding should help your project to break even, not to make a profit on top of your costs that you have. Also ineligible are payments of debts incurred before the grant begins. These grant funds being used to match another SMOC grant, and applicants that have past due final reports. So this is an overview of some of those eligibility guidelines. It's important to check we have both program guidelines available and our general grant guidelines, and I will show you where those are located later on. For both of these grants, your project will need to have a start date and an end date. The start date would be the point at which your project is getting started, and would include activities like auditions and rehearsals, advertising, payment of any sort of fees or contracts, ordering supplies, and you cannot spend any of the grant funds before your project start date. So none of those things that I just listed can happen before the start date that you list. If you do need to spend funds before that start date, for instance, you need to put down a deposit on a contract, then you could not include that amount in the grant budget that you're proposing. We also require that no paid advertising is done before the start date. You can do some really basic things like posting a date for your event, but we really ask that you wait to do advertising until your start date. So with all of these things that have to happen, keep in mind that your start date should not be the date of your first event. You need to make sure you have time to do all of these preparations before then. You also need to choose an end date for your project. Give yourself plenty of time for all of the bills to come in so you can pay them and just wrap everything up. So for this year, we have 3 deadlines for art projects and art legacy projects. They have the same deadlines. We've already passed the first round, which was due July 24th. But coming up, we have round 2 that is due December 11th for projects starting February 1st or later. And then our round 3, the deadline is March 25th for projects starting May 1st or later. So it's a good idea to be really thinking ahead with your projects about when you're going to need to be getting started on them in order to determine which round you need to apply in. So this December 11th round coming up is the perfect time to apply for things that you have going on during the summer and even early fall. Um, and then the March 25th deadline is a good time for things happening fall, later summer of the next year. So you really need to be thinking ahead a little bit. And then all applications need to be submitted through our online system by 4:30 p.m. on the deadline date. The system will not allow you to submit after that time. For your project, you'll need to have a project director and an authorizing official. Your project director would be the person who's really most directly responsible for the project. Oftentimes it's the grant writer as well, but it doesn't have to be. And then the authorizing official would be the president, treasurer, or someone else who has authorizing power for your organization. And these two roles cannot be the same person. You need to be able to have two different people signing off on your application, contract, and final report. If your organization is not an official 501c3 nonprofit, or it is not a unit of government like a city or a county, you will need to find an organization that is one of those things to act as your fiscal sponsor. When you're applying, you'll need to include a signed agreement that you have that spells out the relationship between your organization and the fiscal sponsor organization. I can show you later when we go into the application. There is a sample agreement there if you're wondering what kinds of information that would need to include, but it just would explain how payments are being made, who has what responsibility. So a representative of the fiscal sponsor organization needs to sign your application, contract, and final report as well. And they will receive the grant funds and are legally responsible for the management of those funds and the completion of the project. I see I've got a couple questions coming in here. I have one that says, can the project director or authorizing official be on the SMOC board? Or is that a conflict of interest? The project director or authorizing official can be on the SMOC board, but then they would declare that conflict of interest and not score or vote on anything having to do with that application. I'll just stop here for a few minutes. If you've got anything else you'd either like to type into the chat box, or I will unmute you all for a couple minutes too. Are there any questions so far? I've got another question that just came through. If our arts project director works from our St. Paul office, but our project is in the SMOC region, would they be eligible to be listed on the budget? I think I talked with you about this a little before in an email earlier. And since they are operating outside of our region, they're operating from that St. Paul office, they would not be able to include any costs for themselves in the budget. I'm going to mute you all again for the time being and continue on. And if you think of any other questions, please feel free to either type them in the chat window or save them for another question stop. Have taken us over to our website and show you a few things that are available to you there. On the home page, we've got in this black box here, there's a login button that takes you to the online grant system login. So that's one of the ways that you can get to that system. Otherwise, each of the pages for the individual grant programs has a link to that as well. We're going to take a look at the page for art project grants. So up here is that button that also takes you to the online grant system. Even though it says apply now, you can use that to just return to the system as well. So what we have available for you for each program here are the guidelines that are specific to art projects. We also have our general grant guidelines, which apply to all of our grant programs. We've got the application questions that are in a Word document. So if you'd like to write your draft in there first and then paste everything into the application questions in the system, you can do that. Budget form is available here, although you can also download that from within the application. Here's a list of the criteria that our reviewers will be using to score your application, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Then we've got a couple tutorials here. First, a video tutorial that's just a brief overview of how to get logged in and started in the online grant system. And then this PDF here goes into a bit more detail and kind of tells you what all of the buttons do within the system. We have listed here all of our deadlines for the year. So here's round 2, which is the one coming up. It's got the application deadline, when that grant panel will be reviewing, action by our board, and then your earliest start date. If you return here in a few days after the webinar, you'll find a video recording of this webinar, or if you'd like to look at a past one, they are available here. So we will go into the grant system. And one thing I will note, they have Google Translate on here. So if you choose a language on here, it will translate the interface to that language, although it will not translate any information that you type in once you're in there. I'm just going to sign in here. If you are a new applicant, you would click on the Create New Account. Otherwise, you can just log in. If you're not sure whether you have an account or not for your organization, just check with us and we can let you know. All right, so once you log in, if you've applied before, you will come to your dashboard and you would then click this apply button up here. If you're coming into the system for the first time, it will take you directly to this apply screen. It has all of our programs that are currently open listed here, so you'll just need to scroll through and find the one you're looking for. We'll take a look at art projects. Got some basic information there for you. If you want to preview the application without actually starting anything, there's this preview button here. Otherwise, if you're ready to get started, you can click the apply button. So we have now started our art project application. I'm going to point out a couple of new buttons we have this year up at the top. One is the Copy Previous Answers button. So if you have done other applications in the past, you can choose one of those to copy from, and any questions that were the same between the two applications will copy over for you, saving you some time. Also, we have our Collaborate button. So if you have somebody else with your organization that you'd like to be working with you on the application, you can type in their email address here, choose what permissions you'd like to give them, and send them a little message saying, can you please fill in the audience numbers or something like that. They don't need to already have an account in the system in order to do this. It will ask them to enter their email address and create a password. And that's all that they'll need to do to collaborate with you to begin with, and if at a later date they'd like to fill in the rest of their profile for a full account, they can do that. So you'll start out with just a brief name for your project, help you and us identify which one this is. You can put in the amount you're requesting here. You'll probably want to wait to do that until you've completed your budget form. Here we've got links available to the guidelines again and that Word document with the application questions. We have a reminder that we have a pretty big character limit in our narrative fields, but we still really appreciate short, concise answers because the grant reviewers will be reading quite a lot of applications. We have that bigger limit if there's a question where you really need to explain something very deeply, but there's no need to feel like you need to use up all of those characters. Here's also a link to that score sheet again that the evaluators will be using. I'm just looking at a question that I've had come in. So the question they are talking about in their art crawl, having a chartered bus from Marshall to bring Marshall people to the crawl with a poet aboard the bus to do some readings as the bus is going from site to site. Would those two things be separate grants, one single grant, or part of something else? Those you can both include in the same grant request. So once you've entered in the name of your project and amount requested, you'll briefly describe the project, and it reminds you that you'll be asked some more details about your project later, so it doesn't have to go into too much detail here. Here you'll put in your start and end dates. This next field is a place for you to enter if there are public events related to your project, what those are, when and where they'll be taking place. And it's really good to be specific here because we use this information to post your events on our area arts calendar, which I will show you. This is on our website, so it's just a listing of everything that's going on in the area, whether it is funded by us or not. So you have, if you provide us full information in there, we can fill this out for you and get your event on our calendar. You're asked some questions about your planning for the project, the publicity that you're going to do. Then we come to the budget section, and there are two sample forms here which are really helpful to look at. And the first one we'll look at is if the amount that you're going to be requesting is less than the maximum amount available, less than $7,000. And I'll just bring up that sample. So this shows a kind of completed budget form and how it looks. So you'll be able to put in all of the expenses that you're going to have. And for instance, here they've got two different things in the same line added together. So if you need to combine things in order to make them fit in here, that's fine. But it helps to explain here what is the mileage actually for instance. So this will total your expenses for you here. Then you'll enter in if you're having any ticket income, if you have any other income. For instance, these people are expecting that they'll have some business sponsorships, so they've put A for anticipated here. If they'd already received some, they would put R for received. And then if your organization is putting up any of its own funds for the project. So once you are filling out this cash match section, This line here will calculate for you the 20% of your total cost. So this is the minimum amount of match that you need to provide. So you just need to make sure that your total is at least this amount. It reminds you again down at the bottom, it calculates that 80% for you, so that's the maximum amount that you can request. And there's another double check calculation here that takes your cash cost minus the match, and what's remaining should be your request amount for your grant. We'll just take a look at the other budget sample, and this is for if your expenses are more than the maximum amount that you can request. So again, you'd enter in all of your expenses, which it totals for you. Then you'll notice here that your cash match is much more than the minimum amount that it calculated for you. Because if you look at the bottom here, your 80% is 11,000, but you can only request 7,000. So you'll need to add to your match to make up the difference there. And again, you want to get this double check amount to equal the maximum amount that you can request. This will make some sense too if you read through some of these explanations here. So once you've been filling out your budget form, maybe you have some information that you wanted to provide that didn't really fit in there. We've got a narrative field here, so if you want to provide some more details about some of those expenses or income, you can explain that here. We ask that you provide a minimum of 2 bids for each equipment purchase or labor needed that's greater than $500, and that's if the actual individual item is $500 or more. You'll provide information about tickets, ticket prices, the number that you're expecting to sell. This next section is really important. It's kind of worth the most points when your application is scored. This is on the artistic quality and merit of your project. So you will list artists and other key personnel that are involved in your project, then just explain why you chose those particular artists, or if you are producing your own concert or something, why you chose the musical numbers that are on the program for that. You'll need to provide resumes or bios for artists or other paid personnel for the project. Then we get to the artist work samples. We'll need to have samples of work from any artists that will be working on your project. It gives you some guidelines here for the different kinds of submissions you may have. We have 3 large work sample upload fields here. If you want to submit up to the limit of 10 images, however, you would have to combine several images into one document in order to upload. And then we also have down here some website fields. If you type a website into one of these other fields, the reviewers are not able to access that. Can't even copy and paste. So if you put it in here, it'll make it into a link for you, and they'll be able to just click on that globe symbol and go to those. Next section is all on the impact of your project, talking about how the project meets the artistic needs of your community, how it helps your organization or your community grow, what kind of support you get from the groups in your community like businesses, other organizations, and individuals. Then we just have some audience numbers here. This next section is on reaching the underserved and underrepresented in your community. So we first would like you to describe the groups in your community that could be underserved or underrepresented, and it gives you just a range of ways to consider that to come up with who in your community might be underserved. And then in this next question, we'd like you to talk about how you would reach out or involve at least one of those groups that you mentioned above. And it just gives some examples here of what kinds of things you could do to help them participate in your project. Then we've got some information more specifically about accessibility for those with disabilities. Next section is our outcome evaluation plan. And for those of you who have applied for grants in the past, this is very different from what we've been doing before. This is new for us this year. The State Arts Board and all of the regional arts councils are working together toward these kind of top level goals, and through your grant projects, these various outcomes support those goals. So statewide, we have switched to this different way of doing outcomes. So what you'll do is just read through these outcomes and choose 1 to 3 of them that you think will happen as a result of your project. So you'll just type those numbers in here. Then you will be asked to, for each of those outcomes, say what skill, knowledge, attitude, or behavior will change as a result of your project, and then how you will measure or prove that those changes have taken place. So I've got an example here. Here's somebody's sample project. There are the outcomes that they decided their project would have, who would be affected by each of those outcomes, and then what changes they are expecting related to those, and finally their way of measuring whether those outcomes actually happened. So you would translate this sort of grid into the questions by, here we just put outcome number 4, here's our who, this next part is our change. So you just list all outcomes, who, and change in that first question, and then the measurement or evaluation, those all will go into that second question about how will you know. So here they listed outcome number 4, how they will know. If you have a survey or some questions that you have written up for participant interviews, you can upload that here. That is optional for you to provide. Finally, we get to the section, just some overview of your organization, brief history, your mission statement, the kinds of programs you offer and your primary constituents, some information about your board, who the current board members are, how it operates. Then any grants you've received in the last 3 years from other funders. This next section asks for your most recently completed fiscal year. Then you would answer whether your organization is an official government unit or not. If it is, you would click yes, and there's nothing more you need to answer. If you are not, you've got this brief section with some financial information. You'd enter your beginning balance, which would be your checking savings that your organization has, the income for that year that you noted above, the expenses for that year, and then what you're left with as an ending balance. And there's a narrative field here for you to provide any explanation you want on those numbers. Then this following section is just some data collection that doesn't have any bearing on your actual application. So for these questions that have the link here, it'll bring up a list of codes. You'd find the one that best works for your organization, and then just type that in the field there. We've got some contact information. Here's where you enter in the information about your project director, your authorizing official. Then if you are using a fiscal sponsor, a section will appear where you can enter information for them. Here's where you would upload the file of the agreement that you had between your organization and the fiscal sponsor organization. There's an example available here. You'll also need to provide your 501c3 status letter. If you are not using a fiscal sponsor, obviously you would use your own. If you are using a fiscal sponsor, you would upload that organization's letter. And official government units do not need to upload anything there. Then just if we have questions about your application, you would mark here which of these roles is the grant writer. If you click other, you can put in your information there. Then finally at the bottom, we've got our signatures. So you check the box, yes, everything is true that I put in here. And then for these signatures, you would just type in your name. This is another good place to use that collaborate button from the top, and you could ask your authorizing official, for instance, to come in here and sign their name. So at the bottom here, you've got your save or submit. We're going to save for now. When you do that, it'll list for you all of the required questions that still need to be answered. It won't let you submit the application if any of those are unanswered. And so since we didn't fill in anything, they're all listed. So there it took you back to your application to keep working, but we are going to head back to our dashboard. And here is the new application that we just started. You'll just click here on Edit Application if you want to get back into that. This is the same place you'll come back to later to access a contract and final report, as you see in this sample project below. I am going to move us back to our slideshow here, and we can stop again for some questions. I see another one that has been asked here. Could we include artists from outside the SMOC region to assist our artists in Wilmer with our projects? Yes, you can include them. And you can include mileage within Minnesota, even if they're coming from outside of the SMOC region. You just cannot include travel expenses for outside of Minnesota travel. I'm just going to keep moving on here, and then hopefully in a couple of minutes I can just open it up if anybody has any more questions. So just some tips to think about when you're working on your application. It's a really good idea to start early so that you have time to gather all of those pieces that you're going to need, the work samples, documents, dates, numbers, and so you have time to get any questions answered. Read the guidelines carefully, both the ones for the specific program and the general guidelines. Also good to make sure you read the questions fully. A lot of them have more than one part to them. Make sure you're including all of that. As we talked about before, keep your answers clear and concise. We want to make sure that you are explaining everything fully, but like I said before, no need to try and fill up each of those text boxes. It's also really good to assume that the grant reviewers don't know anything about your organization or your project. It's so easy in our own communities to feel like, well, everybody knows who we are and what we do, but we are drawing reviewers from around the whole region, so it's quite possible that they have not heard about your organization or your project. Also good to have somebody proofread your application. Make sure that your start date is correct, that it's both not before the earliest allowed start date and that you're giving yourself plenty of time to do things before you have actual events coming up. Also, really important to make sure you have your correct amount of cash match and request amount in your budget. We are here to help you with your applications. SMOC staff don't have any say in whether projects are funded or not. We're just here to kind of be your advocate to help you have the best application that you can. So if you want to call us to talk about your project before you even start one, make sure you're applying under the right program. You can contact us with questions anytime as you're filling out your application. We also can review your application before you submit it. If you let us know up to about 2 weeks before the deadline that you think you have this mostly together, then we can take a look at it and let you know if there's anything that you are missing, or maybe you read a question a little differently than we were looking for or something like that. So if you can reach out to us at least 2 weeks before the deadline, we can guarantee that we're able to take a look at it. After that point, we can't guarantee that. So what happens once you submit your application? SMOC staff will review it for eligibility and completeness. If you are missing something important at that point, there is a 48-hour period for you to make any corrections. Then your applications are sent to a panel of individuals from around our region who will discuss and score the applications based on the criteria for that program. And then their recommendations and scores will go to our board of directors, who will approve funding based on those recommendations. The criteria for art project and art legacy project include the artistic quality and merit of the project, which you see is worth the most amount of points at 18. We also look at the impact on the participants and audience, how well you are reaching the underserved, your ability to accomplish the project, which will include things like, does your budget seem reasonable? Have you allowed yourself enough time, etc. And finally, your outcome evaluation plan. And you will need to pass on all of these criteria in order to be considered for funding. If your grant is awarded, you'll need to complete an online contract within 30 days. We saw where those were located earlier. After you complete your contract, you'll receive 80% of your grant award before your start date, and then you'll receive the remaining 20% after your project and final report are completed. You'll need to acknowledge the grant on all publicity and promotional materials, and we'll provide you the credit line and any logos that you need for that. You may need to include that Minnesota Legacy logo in your publicity depending on the source of funds for your grant. You need to complete an online final report within 60 days after your project end date. It's a good idea once you are just getting started on your project to go in and look through their final report online, and then you'll know what kind of information you need to gather throughout the project. We also expect that you are going to spend what you proposed in your budget, and if it looks like something with your expenses is going to need to change, please contact us to get those changes approved in advance. We really want you to spend the full amount that you budgeted, so this is not the time after you get the grant to start looking for ways to save money. You can contact us anytime with questions. We are in our office in Marshall Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., though not always over the lunch hour. We can be reached by phone or email, and just let us know if you have any questions for us. I'm going to open us all back up if there is anything else you'd like to talk about. So you are all unmuted now. Are there any other questions that you had on specifics for this program or the process? I see a question coming through. What is the award rate? In past years, we really have awarded a lot of our applicants. Probably had been 80 to 90%, but I will say that we have been getting a lot more applications than we used to, so that is going down. Any other questions that you have? If there's a project that you'd like to run through, I can stay on for a while if you have specific things you'd like to discuss. If you don't have any questions, thanks for joining us today. That's all that we were planned to talk about. So thanks for listening to this, and let us know if you run into any questions down the road.